Let's take a look at how we can do HTTPS both in development and in production. Now we're going to be using Cloudflare for this because, well, they make it really easy to do both. That is, you don't have to worry about the certificates at all. Cloudflare is going to take care of all of that. And we'll even see how we can deploy some very basic applications onto virtual machines with a load balancer and not have to touch the certificates at all, or the HTTPS certificates at all. Cloudflare is going to handle all of that. We're going to start in our development environment. So I want you to think of an application you might be running locally. Let's say, for instance, on localhost 8000, and you want to share that application to someone else. Now, of course, if you send them localhost 8000, they won't have access to it because it's not running on their machine, on their local host. So the way we solve this is by Cloudflare Tunnels. It allows us to put a domain name on top of that local host with the security in there as well. So HTTPS will be in there, as well as other security features that Cloudflare has. So that's what we need to set up right now. Now, in order for us to do this, of course, you need to sign up on cloudflare.com, and then you're also going to need a domain name that you control. In my case, I'm going to be using this hungrypie.com domain name that we're going to go ahead and use both for our tunnel and for our production environment. But the idea here is you can either register on Cloudflare directly, or you can go ahead and add in a new domain name on your own. Once you add in a new domain name, you're going to need to update the name servers for that domain name. What this means is Cloudflare is going to handle all DNS records once you do that, right? So if you actually go into those websites, once you have it all set up and you use the free plan, everything we're going to do here is going to be in that free plan, then you'll have all of your DNS records in here. Now, I recommend using a domain name that you don't already actively use. Use a brand new domain name, otherwise you might have issues accessing something that is actively used. In other words, hungrypie.com does nothing right now. There's literally nothing on there on purpose, right? Every once in a while, if you check it yourself, you might see something on there, but this is a domain name I use just for R&D or testing purposes. So I recommend that you do the same thing. Now, at some point, we might have something on that domain name. Actually, we will see that very, very soon. But the idea here is you want to make sure that your name servers are done and that it says active. That process is pretty straightforward, but it's going to be different for everyone depending on where you purchased your domain name. I purchased mine on a standard domain name registrar, and then I moved it over to Cloudflare. You can also purchase it on Cloudflare. It's completely up to you. The prices are different for all kinds of different domain names. Bringing it over to Cloudflare means that all of your DNS management will be done through Cloudflare as well. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and actually implement our first tunnel. Now that we have a domain name hosted inside of Cloudflare, we're going to go ahead and create our first tunnel. What you need to do on the sidebar here is go into Zero Trust. So inside of Zero Trust, we're going to go ahead and look at networks and then tunnels. We're going to go ahead and add our new tunnel. Notice that it says to install and authenticate Cloudflare. That is definitely something you're going to need to do, which you'll see the commands for it in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and add this tunnel here using Cloudflare. There are some new ones that are coming out, but I'm going to use Cloudflare in my case. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and name this one. I'm going to just call this Hungry Pie. You can call it whatever you like. Just make sure it's something that is very clear as to what you're using. I'm going to save this tunnel here, and then here's all of the different ways on how you can go ahead, install, and connect it. Right. So now what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy this install command, and I'm going to bring it into my project here, which we'll come back to in a little bit. But the idea is we see that there's this brew install Cloudflare. This is using Homebrew on a Mac computer, but of course it's going to be different if you're not on a Mac. If you are on a Mac or you're using whatever system, like I said, there's a lot of different options on how you can set this up. The key part is this token right here. So once you actually run this installation process, the Cloudflare token will be available. Once you want to stop it, you can just uninstall it just like that. So I'm going to go ahead and show you this right now. So we'll go ahead and install it. I'm going to put in my super user password there. There it is. It's now installed, and we can actually see that it is running by going to next. I'll come back to the public host names in a moment, but we can see that Cloudflare is there and it is healthy. as soon as I run the uninstall command, guess what's going to happen? It's going to go ahead and say that it's not healthy. Let me just refresh this page real quick. There it is. It is now down. And so we could always just delete this as well. So if you want it to be down and no longer accessible, boom, that's how you do it. And then, of course, you go ahead and create a new one whenever you need to. And so I wouldn't recommend doing the new one all the time. It's probably something you can do from time to time. It's really just about securing it better. Every once in a while, you might want to have a new token in there. Now, I don't actually know if this token is the same. It probably isn't, but now I can verify that it's not. As you can see there, when I select it, it is not the same. But of course, if I were to select this, it would show other instances of that. There we go. Okay, so now that we can have it installed, we now have our Cloudflare item in here. It's ready to go, but it's not quite there. So next up, what I want to do is actually add in a public host name for this network. So this is going to be accessible from anyone in the world. The key here is a domain is already in there. So if you didn't already have a domain in there, well, this part wouldn't work, clearly. So what I also want to have in here is a subdomain. I'm going to call this subdomain, let's call it like our tunnel or something like that. You can call it whatever you want. You can also call it dev environment or something along those lines. But whatever you put here is going to then be attached to a local host. So in localhost, yes, you can absolutely use HTTPS localhost as well with something like Caddy. I'm going to be using HTTP, and then I'll go ahead and do localhost and then with a specific port. Now, if you're using Django, the port is 8,000 a lot of times. If you're using Flask, I think it's a lot of times 5,000. If you're using Next.js, it's going to be 3,000. Whatever port you put here is what's going to be mapped up here. Just keep that in mind. Every once in a while, maybe you put an optional path on there. I'm just going to go ahead and stick with port 8,000, just like that. Save it. Great. Now, this endpoint, let's go back into that connector itself, or rather into the tunnel itself, and go to edit, go into public host name. This domain right here is quite literally the domain that I can now access locally. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that domain here. Let's go ahead and just take a look at it. And this is what you get when your local project is not actually running. So we will run a local project in just a moment, but we are in a really good spot if we're right here. We're basically almost done with setting up the Cloudflare tunnel. Of course, if you know how to run a local project at port 8000, then you're probably done already. But I'm going to show you how to do it. Let's take a look. Now that we have our Cloudflare tunnel, let's go ahead and run a Python application on port 8000 so we can actually just see that, yes, in fact, the tunnels do work. Now, I know that they work, but let's go ahead and take a look at it anyway. What you would want to do here if you want to copy me directly is you're going to go ahead and clone this repo or fork it. Either way, download it to your local machine. You can even download the code directly from a zip file. Then you're going to install Python. Then you're going to install the requirements. Then you're going to run it. I'm not going to do those things in this video because I do it in a lot of other places. And also the point here is really just to validate that the tunnel is working. That's it. So the idea then is once you actually have that code locally, it's going to look something like this. I created a virtual environment. I activated that virtual environment. And now I can see that I have Python 3.8 installed. All I want to do is run this. So if you're on Windows, this part might not work as seamless as what I'm about to do because of GUnicorn. Now, if you're on Windows and GUnicorn works, great. If you're not, great too. Just use Waitress instead. So in the case of Python, we're going to go ahead and do python-m pip install-r requirements.txt. All this does is set up the environment so that it can run things like GUnicorn. Then I'm going to go ahead and use this right here and just run it. So what I should see is the default for GUnicorn, this is a web server interface, is 8000. That default I can open up on my local machine, and there it is. So this is the same thing as localhost 8000. It's just a little bit different of a name. But overall, the project is actually running at port 8000. Now we can verify that it's running on our tunnel by going back into our domain name and refreshing in there. What do you know? We have our domain name now, and we have HTTPS. it is now, of course, working. As soon as I close out this server with Control-C or Command-C, you can actually see it's no longer running. If I were to run it again, it's back up and running. Fantastic. This is what that tunnel does. It allows us to really quickly and easily share our local development environment in a secure manner. And of course, we can always take it down at any time. So anytime you need, just go ahead and open up the uninstall command and that will take it off. It'll take it offline altogether. This removes it from your local machine. Now, depending on what machine you're on, you might get a notification saying Cloudflare is trying to run in the background. You can choose whether or not you want that to happen. I do recommend having it run in the background, otherwise you might not have access to these things. But if you're ever concerned about security, just uninstall it whenever you need to. You can even do it from the actual source, like brew uninstall that thing. But overall, that's a very straightforward and easy way to now share our project anywhere in the world. Now that we've seen our development environment, let's move over to our production environment. Now you can use tunnels in production. That's not what we're doing right now. We are going to be using a different method, which is really just Cloudflare's proxying service that adds HTTPS as we see fit. So we're going to set that up. But before we do, we need to actually deploy our applications somewhere. We're going to be using Linode for this, or Akamai Linode. You can grab a free credit on my account since I do a lot of work with them. You don't have to use Akamai Linode. The point of this is once you have an account somewhere, you're going to implement a load balancer and a virtual machine. I'm just using Akamai Linode as an example of what you could do, but you can do the same process on DigitalOcean, on Hertzner, on AWS. There's a lot of different options as to where you could deploy it in terms of virtual machines. But the key here is the place that we deploy it to can be changed on a dime thanks to Cloudflare as well. So it really makes us really portable with our applications. So with this in mind, I'm going to go ahead and start the process of actually creating a virtual machine and a load balancer on Akamai Connected Cloud, also known as Linode. So jump into your account there if you don't already have one. Go ahead and create a Linode here. We are going to be using Ubuntu and a LTS version. Whatever LTS you see, the top one, just grab that. That's going to work for this. Now, select a region that's near you. In my case, Seattle, Washington's near me. Then I'm going to go ahead and use a shared CPU here and the $5 a month plan. So yes, there can be costs associated to this, especially if you went through your service credit that you can get by signing up with me. But the idea here is it's only $5 a month. That is so incredibly cheap for what we're about to do. The load balancer might cost a little bit too, but it's not going to cost much. Anyways, the idea here is create that shared GPU, or shared CPU rather, the shared virtual machine, give it a label of some kind. So I'm going to go ahead and say Hungry Pie 1, and let's spell Hungry Pie correctly. There we go. You don't have to call it that. You can call it whatever you'd like. Next up, what I want to do is actually build out a password of some kind. So I'm going to use OpenSSL rand base 64 and 32. This will give me these random passwords. I think this works cross-platform, so you should be able to get this password here. This is what I'll actually use for SSH. So I'm going to leave it here. Then I'm going to go ahead and bring in this root password. Now, I already have my SSH keys on here, so I'm going to go ahead and put that one on. But of course, that password might be how some of you actually log into this. Next up, what we need is a private IP. Make sure you add that one as well. Then I'm going to go ahead and create this. So I'm not going to save that password, but I will keep note of the fact that I will be SSHing into this location very soon. Before I do, though, I'm going to go into my node balancers here. This is the same thing as a load balancer, but it's just managed by Linode or Akamai Connected Cloud. I'm going to come in here. I'm going to call it Hungry Pie. You can add tags if you like to. The region has to be the same as your Linode region. So in my case, it's going to be Seattle, Washington. This is probably going to be true on all of the different load balancers that are out there that are managed. They most likely will have to be in the same region themselves. So we're going to go ahead and grab that same region, which was Washington. I'm not going to put any firewalls at this time, but I'm going to configure port 80. This is the default non-secure or HTTP port. HTTP, the actual secure port would be 443, but we want to use port 80. Cloudflare is going to give us the secure one, not Akamai Connected Cloud, but Cloudflare, which is really nice. So we can just leave that as is. Next up are actual nodes themselves. We can write node 1, or you could do hungrypi-1, which is the same name as the node we gave it, which I'm not sure if that's exactly it or not. But anyways, we're going to go ahead and jump in here on the IP address here. This is a private IP address that it's going to forward. Hey, what do you know? Here's a port here. This time I'm going to use port 8080, and that's it. Now I'll go ahead and create this node balancer. This node balancer is where we want to forward our Cloudflare managed domain. And what do you know? There's an IP address right here. Go ahead and grab this IP address, jump back into Cloudflare, grab your domain name, go into DNS, and then we're going to go ahead and create a new record. As in, let's go ahead and say prod, make sure it's an A type, bring in the IP address and have it proxied. I'm going to go ahead and hit save. There we go. We have now proxied that load balancer, which of course, if I go to prod.hungrypi.com and hit enter, it gives me a 503. This, of course, is because I don't actually have anything running on the virtual machine this node balancer is going to. So in these configurations, it says 0 up, 0 down. This actual instance is not running. Of course it's not. We haven't set it up. But if you already know how to set those things up, you could totally stop right now and you'd be done. I want to show you actually how to set them up for real using the Docker container that actually exists. So we're going to install Docker and set up this container to make sure it's running so that we can just verify that this proxied HTTPS is actually working for us, which we'll see here very, very soon. Now we're going to configure our virtual machine to actually run a Docker container. Now, if you're not familiar with Docker containers or containers in general, they are a really nice way to package up your application. So all you really need to worry about is the container runtime, not the application runtime. This will become a little bit more obvious when we actually do it again, which will be in the next part. So the first part here, we want to go into Akamai Linode, grab the virtual machine we're going to use. In our case, it's hungrypi-1, and then we want to SSH into it. So one of the cool things about using something like VS Code or Cursor, which is based off of VS Code, is the extension library for SSH. So if you actually do a quick search for SSH, you'll see there's this remote SSH extension that actually Microsoft manages themselves, which I highly recommend installing. The reason being is that once you actually install it, you can do down here in the corner, you'll see this green thing where it says connect to host. Then you'll be able to add a new SSH host, which in our case is going to be literally from Linode. So I can just go ahead and hit enter there. And then I can update the configuration, the default configuration with that host. We can even take a look at what that looks like. It's this right here. So we can also rename it as, something like hungrypi-1, just like that. Then I select this again, connect to host. Now I can select that actual host and open it up. So when you first try to connect to this, it's going to look for this fingerprint. You're going to want to say, yes, this is a valid host I want to connect to. If you didn't have SSH keys, it's going to ask you for that password you created before. Now, we are actually inside of that virtual machine. We created a SSH connection with it, but now we're using VS Code, so it's not a whole lot different than our local development environment, which I find to be really nice. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to open up my root project here, or the root folder, and I'm going to go ahead and trust all these authors here. Now, as far as best practices are concerned, we're kind of waiving those right now in terms of using a virtual machine so that we can actually verify that the things that I told you actually work, and they work really well. So what I need to do is I need to install Docker. The way I install Docker is by using curl-f and then S_L and then https://git.docker.com. And then I output it to a file called install-docker.sh. This is a command shell that we can run. And if you look at it, you can see that it's the Docker engine script for Linux to be installed, right? So if I do sudo chmod +x of that script, what I'm doing here is I'm allowing permissions to run that script itself. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab that script and then run it. So if you're not familiar with this process, of course, curl is a way to open up a web page. Then we can output it here. So basically we are downloading a file. Then we're saying, hey, that file can be downloaded and also ran. Then I'm going to go ahead and run it. And all this is doing is now installing everything related to Docker. To me, this is by far the best way to install Docker on pretty much any Linux machine, even if it's not Ubuntu like what we set up. So I'm going to let this process finish. It should take not that long. As you see, it just finished. And then I can run something like Docker PS. If you can't run Docker PS, then you might need a different way of installing Docker, of course. But the idea now is I need an application to actually run here. Now, the way I'm going to do this is by going back into the code here on my GitHub channel for IAC Python and take a look at compose.prod.yaml. I'm going to go ahead and copy this file just by clicking that. Then back into my virtual machine, I'm going to go ahead and do compose.yaml. And we're going to go ahead and paste this in here. Now, if you're not familiar, this is called a Docker Compose file. This is a really simple way to run a container image and to manage various things like a actual port variable. What do you know? Port 8080. Do you remember where we saw that before? I'll talk about it in just a second and show you exactly where it's from. But the idea now is we do Docker Compose up and then -d. -d means that when this virtual machine restarts, it's going to restart this container image right here. It also means that, well, it's going to run in the background. If I did just up, it would run in the foreground, which is not what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel that out and do -d so that I can leave this virtual machine and just assume that this project is running. So I'm going to let that finish, and now we'll take a look at the port itself. Now, the port itself has to do with, well, going back into our virtual machine, we are going to be running this container on this virtual machine's port 8080, similar to like what we might do on our local machine. But the thing is, our load balancer, the node balancers here, if I take a look at that, I can see the configurations. In here, we have port 80. This is what Cloudflare is going to look for. But the backend node, the individual virtual machine itself, what do you know? There's port 80 right there running. So I shouldn't have to change anything here. And really, I just need to make sure that that is up and working. Right now, it looks like it's running. Even though that, Akamai isn't showing it running, I'm going to go ahead and jump into that domain I created before, and I'm going to refresh in here. What do you know? There we go. It is now working. We've got HTTPS in there and a domain name all together. This is fantastic. This is so easy to do. Once you get into the habit of doing it, this is going to be a no-brainer. But the thing is, I want to show you one other method you might want to do when it comes to using these load balancers. And that is really just creating another virtual machine and attaching it to the load balancer so you can have a sense as to why we use the load balancer in the first place, not just a single virtual machine. Let's take a look. In a moment, we're going to take a look at why using a load balancer is highly, highly recommended. But before we do, I want to mention something about the configuration of this proxy inside of Cloudflare. So first and foremost, we have our A type, and the actual IP address goes to that load balancer. And of course, it is proxied. Now, when we do proxies like this, what you also want to check out is the SSL/TLS configuration. In my case right now, it's configured to flexible. If for some reason you were to change this, you might have issues actually accessing the service itself. So let's say, for instance, I did full here, and then I refresh on my what was working before is no longer working. So do keep that in mind when it comes to actually using SSL and this proxy service. Of course, if you needed to make it a little bit different, you can. It just takes a lot more configuration. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring it back into flexible. So it might take a moment for that to propagate and fully change. So while that's working, we're going to go back into Linode here, and we're going to go ahead and clone our previous Linode, that previous virtual machine. So I'm going to go and click these little dots, hit clone, and now I'm going to call this one to being 2. Or, well, actually, we're going to clone from Hungry Pie 1 into the same location, into the same plan. This one down here, the label will be 2. Then we also want to go ahead and make sure that we are adding the private IP address in here. Now, everything else about it is going to be the same. So I'm going to go ahead and create this Linode here and let that configure. Now, part of the reason I'm cloning it right now has to do with the fact that Docker is already installed. If I wanted to reinstall Docker, I totally could, and I can do it the exact same way as we just did. But once that part's still running, while it's running, I'm going to go into my node balancers here. I'm going to grab Hungry Pi. I'm going to go into configurations, into port 80, the port 80 configuration specifically. I'm going to go down here and I'm going to add a new node here. This node is going to be Hungry Pi 2. And what do you know? It's going to be going to the Hungry Pi 2 instance, the Hungry Pi 2 virtual machine. This time I'll leave port 80. This port won't work by default. We will need to make it work. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save here. Actually, let's change it to something like 8001. I just want to change it so it's quite a bit different than what you might expect. Okay, different enough from the last two and also different from the node balancer itself. Great. So I need to let this finish cloning and then booting, which might take a moment for that to happen. While that's happening, I will say the thing I'm going to be switching to is just a different container image using CFE Nginx, which has a few configuration items on here, which of course I will show you how to configure. But the idea overall is these are pre-built container images. They already exist, they're already accessible, and they are already public. That is one of the biggest caveats to this series right here, is that I'm just using things that are public. If you wanted to have private ones, it's a little bit different and, well, quite a bit more cumbersome of a project to actually set up these themselves. Like you would need to log into Docker Hub and you need to be able to have access and all that. So now that we've got our clone on here, looks like I can boot it up. And this process is going to be very similar to what we did before. And we're going to go ahead and jump back into VS Code. I'm going to go ahead and navigate to my main project here where I can see that it says open remote window, not the current instance that I'm already running, which you can leave on if you want to, or you could turn it off. I'm now going to go ahead and add in a new host here. This is going to be that host. I'm not going to confirm it until it's fully running. Looks like it is. So I'm going to go ahead and hit confirm. Once again, I'm going to go ahead and update my SSH configuration, which is already open, and there it is right there. And I don't need to open up the configuration again. But now I'm going to go ahead and add it in. And this one is actually this one right here. So this should be Hungry Pi and 2. There we go. And of course, I can verify that host name right here. There it is, .78, Hungry Pi 2 up here. And there we go. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and create another session into that host, Hungry Pi 2. We're going to open that thing up. And I'm going to go ahead and say that it has this fingerprint. That's good. Let's go ahead and do that. And enter the password, the user password, if you need to. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and open that folder, that root folder. Looks like I will still need to trust these authors. This is a VS Code thing, not so much anything else. Okay, so right off the bat, we see that Docker Compose and install Docker is already on this cloned machine. If I do Docker PS, hey, what do you know? It's actually running that other container instance itself, which is pretty cool. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to do Docker Compose down. This will use compose.yaml and take that previous one down for us. Now what I want to do is actually change it to being that CFE Nginx project that I mentioned before. Once again, this is a public container image. The port environment variable is no longer necessary. Now we need to customize these ports. I think I had port 8001. Now, CFE Nginx, I built this one, so I know exactly what the internal port is, and that's going to be port 80. There's a huge discussion we can have on all this stuff. That's not the point here. The point is to make sure that this is working different. Now we've got Docker Compose up, and then once again, I'll do that detached mode. If I did things correctly, it's going to try to pull a new image. It's going to pull quite literally this one right here. Then, of course, it's going to be in detached mode, which if I do Docker PS, I can see that it seems to be running with the correct image and also at my local host port 8001. So by the looks of it, my now node balancer should be up and running. So if I actually go back into my node balancer, this is now, it says one up and one down. In a very short amount of time, it's going to have both of those things up. I can also test my actual Proxied domain name. And if I refresh in here, here's that first one we saw. That one's running, no surprise there. If I were to refresh a few times, I can now see a completely different page. This is really highlighting the load balancer nature. It's going to flip back and forth between these two things. Load balancers are very common. They work on a lot of cloud host providers. In this case, I just used Akamai Linodes, but the idea is based on our configuration, it does this thing called round robin. So it's going to go on each virtual machine at the designed ports that we have in here. So port 880, port 8001, and now we have a proxied load balanced version of these different applications that are running. What you do from here is just build out your own container images and have those things running. Then your production application and your production domain name would be fully ready. It's pretty great. So the next part, I just want to take everything down just to make sure that it's all done. Otherwise, this is the setup. This is what I recommend doing. Now, the other thing about this DNS here is you can also proxy other things. So let's say, for instance, you deploy to Kubernetes and you were to get the IP address from there. You can proxy that as well, and you won't need to provision certificates. Cloudflare is going to do that for you. There's a lot more to it than just that, but that's the general idea. It's pretty cool. And it's also not a whole lot different than what we just did, which is also really, really nice. All right, so let's go ahead and undo a few things. The first one is going to be our Linodes in here. I want to actually delete these. Now, of course, you could have these up and running if you want to, but every once in a while, you're going to go through this cleanup process where you remove old items in there altogether. And then I can come in here and do that same thing. Great. So the idea here is the node balancer is still up, in which case our actual production environment might be up for a moment because it's going to be cached most likely, but then it's just going to say it's down. So if you ever want to bring it back up, all you need to do is add new instances on this node balancer. So this is actually one of the biggest reasons to use this as well, is that if you want to slowly, incrementally deploy new versions of your application, you can use a load balancer to do that and just add in nodes as you see fit, or remove them as you see fit as well. Of course, if you delete them, they get removed as well. But I want to go ahead and delete the entire node balancer itself, just to make sure that I'm not getting any extra payments whatsoever. And of course, if there are any images in here, I might want to delete them as well. This is one that's not relevant. Okay, so there we go. So that's now done in terms of what we want. Next up, what you might want to do, notice that VS Code is going to say, hey, I can't connect. It's disconnecting from these things because those are no longer valid. Inside of config, which of course you can get to by going into connect to host, configure SSH hosts, and take a look at that file there. You can now delete those as well. Save that file in there. Great. So that's going. The next thing is maybe you want to uninstall the tunnel itself and just make sure that that is off also. In which case, what I would do then is go back into my Cloudflare account and then navigate into the tunnels themselves and then delete your old tunnel. You can always add these things again whenever you need to. Now, in my case, I often have the same tunnel. I might rotate the tunnel for different projects as well, just being aware of what port I am using on there. And so, but deleting it is always an option as well, which you can run through and go back into your tunnels here, navigate to this and then delete tunnel. Great. So obviously I uninstalled Cloudflare D. I uninstalled that before I deleted the tunnel, which you could do it in either order. But of course, if you get rid of that tunnel, make sure you definitely uninstall Cloudflare itself. Great. So that's unpacking things just a little bit. If you have questions on this, let me know. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this, and thanks to Cloudflare for sponsoring this series. Now, I've become a big fan of Cloudflare, not just because they've sponsored what I do, but also because they just have a great product. It's actually really easy to get a lot of things up and going. One of the things I'm using right now are the custom email forwarding. So you can quite literally forward any email with any domain name. I'll show you how to configure that. Check the link in the description. But overall, thanks again for watching. Let me know if you want to see me build anything else on top of Cloudflare or using stuff like their workers in the comments below. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Thanks again.